The slab came down at 6:41. 400 people were standing in the square outside with programs in their hands for a reopening that was never going to happen. I was alone on the atrium floor of the Ardent with a crate of mural panels and 11 minutes of work left in me. Corin Vale came back in through the doors that everyone else had just gone out of. She was 34. She had been my alpha wife for 4 years, and nothing to me for 2. She crossed 90 feet of marble without hurrying, because she had never once hurried in her life, and she put her body over mine as the ceiling arrived. Then dark, then dust in my teeth, then her voice very close to my ear, saying 3 words. She said, "I have you." I lived the next 5 hours inside those 3 words, and I have been living inside them ever since.
Welcome, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up. If I leave it there, you will think this is a story about a building falling down, and it is not. The building took 9 seconds. The rest of it took 2 years, and I was awake for all of them. 11 weeks earlier, a letter came to my workroom with the firm's name on it that I had trained myself not to read. I am a conservator. That word does a lot of work, and most of it is boring. It means I spend my days on a scaffold with a scalpel the width of a thumbnail, taking 100 years of soot off other people's work 1 square inch at a time. It means I know more about the chemistry of failure than about anything else in the world. Paint fails, plaster fails, copper goes green and then it goes black, and then it goes away. My job is to slow down the going away. I was 26 that autumn. I had a rented room above a laundry in the customs quarter, a hot plate, a good lamp, and 1 chipped enamel cup that I had taken with me when I left, which I want you to remember because it comes back. The letter was a commission. Vale and Ward, Principal C. Vale for the conservation and remounting of the atrium mural of the Ardent. 41 panels, 8 months, with the reopening ceremony fixed for the 11th of May. I read it twice, standing up. Then I sat on the floor of my own workroom with my back against the plan chest and read it a 3rd time. Here is the part that people always want first, so I will get it out of the way. Her name is Corin Vale. She was 32 when I married her, and I was 22, which everyone in both families had opinions about, and only my mother said out loud. We were bonded 11 months after we met. If you have never been bonded, I am not going to be able to explain it to you properly. And if you have, you already know that the words for it are all wrong. It is not a feeling. It is a fact that lives at the back of your neck, the way the floor is a fact under a chair. You do not think about the floor. You simply never fall. And then for 3 years I fell, slowly, in a house with very good light. Her father's firm was drowning when we married. She did not tell me that. She went into it the way she went into everything, without noise. And she came out the other side 4 years later with the firm alive and with a woman in her house she had stopped being able to see. She was not cruel. I want to be exact because it would be easier for me if she had been cruel. She was never cruel. She was somewhere else. I asked once, only once, and I was careful about how, because I had learned that with Corin, the size of the ask determined the size of the answer. I said the 18th, dinner, 8 o'clock, just us. She said, I will be there. She meant it. She was a woman who meant everything she said, which is a rarer thing than people think, and also, it turns out, not the same as being there. She was not there. I sat until 9:40. I want to tell you I sat until midnight, because that would make a better story and a worse truth. At 9:40, I put the food away in the containers with the blue lids, and I stood at the window over the river, and I did the arithmetic of my own life, which is a thing you should never do standing up. Then I went to the desk and I wrote out the severance. You are allowed to do it. That is the part nobody explains. A bond can be dissolved by the omega alone, in writing, witnessed, and it takes effect at the moment the alpha reads it. It is not a court thing. It is older and stupider than a court. There is a clerk in the diocesan office who has been stamping them for 30 years and who does not look up. I left it on the kitchen counter under the salt cellar, where she would find it at whatever hour she came home, and I took the enamel cup in one coat, and I went to my mother's. I want to be honest about what happened at 3:10 that morning, because I have heard other people describe it, and I think they are lying to be kind. It is not pain exactly. It is subtraction. I was awake in my mother's back room, and at 3:10, the floor stopped being under the chair. Everything I had known about where Corin was in the world, not her thoughts, that is a fairy tale, but the plain animal fact of her, the direction of her, the way you know where the window is in a dark room, went out like a filament, and with it went her scent, which I had been carrying in the back of my throat for 4 years, without ever once having to think about it. Cedar and rain on stone, that is the closest I can get. Cedar and rain on stone. And after 3:10 that morning, nothing. I did not smell her again for 2 years. Hold on to that as well. She did not contest it. That is the sentence I turned over for 2 years like a stone in a pocket. She did not write. She did not come to the laundry room in the customs quarter. And she could have, because the customs quarter is 9 minutes from her office, and she is not a woman who gets lost. Twice I saw her at a distance. Once at the winter market in a charcoal coat that was actually a very dark green if you looked at it in the right light, standing at the flower stall and buying nothing. Once across the river at a dedication on a platform 40 feet up, with the whole quarter clapping and her thumb pressed flat against the band of the watch on her left wrist, which is what she does instead of showing you her face. Both times I left before she turned around. And then 11 weeks before the 11th of May, her firm sent me a letter about a mural. I took it. Of course I took it. There are 3 people in this country who can do what I do, and 2 of them are over 70. And I had 411 in the bank, and a landlord with an opinion. But that is not why. And I am trying not to lie to you this early. The Ardent mural was painted in 1911 across the 4 walls of a customs house atrium. 90 feet of river traffic and cranes, and men with their sleeves rolled. And in 1974, a gilder named Thea Marlow Spent one summer on the scaffold there, putting the water back. Thea Marlow was my mother. She was 19 that summer, and she was not credited anywhere because nobody credited the gilders. And for the rest of her life, she said the same sentence about it in the same flat voice. She said, "I did the river. She died when I was 24. I had 2 years of not being able to talk about her, and then a firm with my ex-wife's initial on the letterhead offered me 8 months on my mother's scaffold. So yes, I took it." I want to say something about how I prepared, because it tells you what kind of person I was that autumn. I wrote out rules, actual rules, on actual paper in the workroom above the laundry the night before I started. 1. She is a client. Clients get the report and nothing else. 2. No trailer, no shared table, no lift. 3. If she says my name, do not answer with hers. 4. 8 months, then out. I pinned it inside the lid of my kit box where I would see it every time I opened it, which turned out to be about 40 times a day for 11 weeks. I have the box still. The paper is still in it. I cannot decide whether that is funny. The first morning was the 4th of March, and the atrium was full of people. That is the thing nobody tells you about a building under restoration. It is not quiet, and it is not reverent. It is 150 trades in high-visibility jackets, a radio nobody owns, a man on a stilt walker taping ceiling grid, 2 women arguing in the doorway about a delivery slot, and dust in a column of light so thick you can put your hand into it and lose the fingers. I came in at 10 to 7 with a kit box on my shoulder, and I stood at the bottom of the north scaffold and looked up at 90 feet of my mother's river under 100 years of soot. Behind me a voice said, "You are early." I did not turn around. Rule 3. I said, "The light is early." There was a pause of about 2 seconds. And in that pause, I understood something that took the rest of the day to arrive properly, which is that I had been able to hear exactly where she was standing. Not by scent, by the plain animal arithmetic of a room. 9 feet back and half a step to the left, near the plan table, absolutely still. Then she said, "Welcome back." And she walked away across the marble with that particular economy of movement she has always had. No wasted inch anywhere in it. And I put my hand on the scaffold rail and held on to it like an idiot until my heart came back down. Her name is on the letterhead, but nobody at the Ardent called her Vale. They called her the principal or ma'am or nothing at all. And they did it with a straightness of back that I recognized from the 4 years I had spent in a house with her. Corin does not command a room. She simply arrives in it and the room reorganizes itself. And afterwards, nobody can tell you which sentence did it because there was not a sentence. I watched a foreman that first morning tell her a schedule was impossible. She listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she said 4 words. She said, "Then we move Tuesday." He said, "Right," and went and moved Tuesday. Marisol Quintero found me at 9 with 2 cups of tea and a face that had already decided how this was going to go. Marisol had been the building manager of the Ardent for 31 years, through the closure and the water damage in the pigeon years. And she was 68 and roughly the shape and temperament of a bollard. She handed me a cup and looked up at the mural and said, "Your mother did the river." I said she did. Marisol said, I know. I brought her tea as well. She said this like it settled something, which it did. Then she said, the principal reviewed 40 applications for this commission. I said, that is a lot of applications. Marisol said, no. It is one application and 39 pieces of paper. Drink your tea. That was the first time somebody said the shape of it out loud. And I put it down where I put everything I did not want, which was the bottom of the kit box, under the rules. By the second week, I had a routine, and the routine had a sound. The kettle in the site trailer went on at 6:40 every morning, not 6:39 and not 6:45. I did not go into the trailer, per Rule 2, but the trailer had a window, and the window faced my scaffold. And at 6:40, I would hear the switch go down, and 11 minutes later, Pilar would come out with 2 cups. Pilar was my apprentice, 23, from the technical school across the river, with a great deal of opinion and a genuinely alarming steadiness of hand. On the 4th morning, she came up the ladder with the 2 cups, and one of them was a chipped enamel cup, cream, with a green rim and a bite out of it at the handle. I said, "Where did you get that?" Pilar said, "It is in the trailer. It is always in the trailer. Is it yours?" I said, "No." And that was true. And it was also the largest lie I told that spring, because I had taken my cup with me when I left, and hers had stayed on the shelf. And this one had a bite out of it at the handle in exactly the place mine did, because we had bought them together in a market town for almost nothing on the second day of a holiday. And there had been 2. I drank out of it for 11 weeks. I never once mentioned it. Neither did she. Here is what I cataloged that first month, without permission from myself. The watch on the left wrist, and the thumb pressed flat to the band when she was deciding something. The tortoiseshell clip that went into her hair at about 11 every morning and came out again at about 4. The coat, charcoal in the doorway, very dark green under the atrium lantern. A fact about that coat that I would have bet money on, and that nobody else in the building appeared to have noticed. The voice, which a colleague of hers once described in my hearing as surgical, unhurried, and which is exactly right, and also entirely insufficient. The way she came to the bottom of the north scaffold at 4 o'clock every day and read the daily condition sheet standing up and never came up the ladder. 11 weeks. She never once came up the ladder. I did not smell her. I want to keep saying that because it mattered more than anything else that spring. 2 feet away in a doorway with the dust hanging in the light between us. And nothing. Cedar and rain on stone, gone since 3:10 on a morning 2 years earlier, and the absence of it was not a hole. It was flatter than a hole. It was like being told a color had been discontinued. There was one afternoon in the 3rd week when I stood at the plan table, and she came and stood on the other side of it and put a drawing down and turned it round so that it faced me. And our hands were perhaps 4 inches apart on the paper. And I leaned very slightly forward before I caught myself. Nothing. Paper and dust and cold marble. She saw me do it. I know she saw me do it because her thumb went to the watch band and stayed there. And she said, "The mounting brackets are wrong on the fourth panel," in a voice with absolutely nothing in it. I said, "They are." She said, "Fix them." I said, "I will." She left. I stood at the table for a while afterwards, with my hand flat on the drawing, in the place where hers had been, which was still warm. On the 9th day, she asked for 20 minutes, and I could not think of a rule that let me say no. The site office was a porta cabin on the riverside with a plan chest, 2 chairs, a heater that made a noise like a wasp, and a window with a view of nothing but hoarding. She was there before me. She had the 8-month program laid out on the chest, and she had already read it, because she always read everything before the meeting and then let you explain it to her anyway. She said, "Sit down." I sat down. Then I said the thing I had been rehearsing on the ladder for 9 days. And I said it badly, the way you always say the rehearsed thing. I said, "I want to set out how I work." She said, "Go on." I said, "You will get a written condition report every Friday and a photographic record every fortnight. If there is a decision that costs money, you will get it in writing before it costs money. I do not attend site socials. I do not use the trailer. I do not discuss anything that is not the mural. When the panels are remounted, I invoice and I go." I had made it all the way through it. I was quite proud of that for about 4 seconds. She said agreed. I had come in braced for an argument, and she had taken the argument off the table in 1 word, and what was underneath it was so much worse. She squared the program with 2 fingers. She said, "Is that all of it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then I have 1 thing." I said, "All right." She said, "I am not going to raise it, not once in 8 months. But you should know I am not going to pretend either. And if you ask me a direct question, you will get a direct answer." I said, "I am not going to ask you anything." She said, "I know." And then she looked at me for slightly longer than the sentence needed, and her thumb went flat to the watch band, and I stood up too fast and put my hand on the door and said the stupidest thing I have said in my adult life, which was, "Thank you for the commission." Behind me, she said, "Thea." That was the first time in 2 years that anyone had said my name in that voice, and it went through the back of my neck like cold water into a glass. I did not turn around. Rule 3. I got 4 steps out of the porta cabin before I turned around anyway, and I went back in, and I asked the direct question. I said, "Why did you not come on the 18th? She did not move. The heater made its noise. Outside, somebody dropped a scaffold board and swore. She said, "I was at the Kestrel Street site until 9. I said, "That is where you were. That is not why." And she took a breath and gave me the honest answer, which is a thing so few people ever do, that when it happens to you, it is almost violent. She said, "Because I thought you would be there tomorrow." I want you to understand that she did not say it as an excuse. She said it the way she reads a condition sheet, flat, complete, no adjective anywhere in it. She had done the arithmetic that a great many people do about the person who is always there. And she had done it wrong, and she was standing in a porta cabin 2 years later telling me so without 1 word of softening. I said I was not there tomorrow. She said no. I said I was gone by 3. She said 10 past 3. The room went quiet in a specific way. I said, "How do you know that?" And she said, "Because that is when the floor went." And she put 2 fingers briefly against the side of her own neck, at the place where the mark used to be on both of us, and then took them away again. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the room above the laundry with the window open onto the customs quarter, and I ran it again and again. 3:10. She had felt it go from wherever she had been standing at the same moment I did, and she had known exactly what it was. And she had not written and not come and not contested it. And now she was paying me a great deal of money to stand on a scaffold in her building for 8 months. At about 4 a.m, I got up and I wrote a 5th rule on the paper in the lid of the kit box. 5. Do not ask her anything else. I kept that one for 9 weeks, which given everything is not a bad run. The 3rd week passed in the strange, suspended quiet of a building being taken apart by people who were being careful about it. We got the first 11 panels off the north wall that week. That is a bigger operation than it sounds. You face the surface with tissue and adhesive. You cut the plaster back to the lath in a line you have already argued about twice. And then 8 people who have all done it before lift 110 kilos of 1911 off a wall and onto a padded frame. And nobody breathes until it is down. On the Thursday, I was on the top platform at 32 feet doing the last of the facing on panel 9 when the scaffold moved. It was nothing. A stilt walker 2 bays over, a board not clipped. The whole thing shifted about 1.5 inches and stopped. But I had a scalpel in one hand, and my other hand went to the rail and missed it. And for about a second, I was a woman standing on a plank. By the time I had the rail, the ladder was already ringing. She came up 11 feet of it and stopped, one hand on either stile, with her head level with my ankle. And she did not come any further. She looked at the boards. She looked at the clip that was not clipped. Then she looked up at me. She said, "All right." Not a question, I said, "All right." Her hand was on the stile, perhaps 4 inches from my ankle, and it stayed there. And I looked at it, and she saw me look at it. And she took it off the stile and put it back on the stile a hand's width lower. Then she went down the ladder and across the floor to the foreman. And I could not hear a word of what she said, and neither could anybody else. And the man who had not clipped the board did not work in that building again. That is the whole of it, by the way. That is the closest we came for 11 weeks. A hand 4 inches from an ankle on a scaffold stile, and it moved away. I put the scalpel down and sat on the platform with my back against the wall for about 10 minutes afterwards. And Pilar came up and said, "Are you shaking because of the board?" I said, "Yes." Pilar said, "All right." She has an alarming steadiness of hand, and she is not a fool. On the 11th night of April, the river gate stuck, and 4 of us were inside the hoarding until 1:30. There is a river gate at the back of the Ardent, a 19th century thing about the weight of a car, and it runs on a chain that had been meaning to fail for some time and picked that night, in that weather, to do it. The storm came up the estuary at about 8. By 10, the quarter had lost power on the north side, and the site had gone over to the generator. And by 11, the 4 of us who were left had established that we were not getting out until somebody came with a cutting kit. Marisol was one. Pilar was one. Corin was one, because she had been in the site office until 10. And because she was the sort of person who was always the last one in a building, Marisol made tea on the trailer ring and produced from somewhere a tin of the kind of biscuits that only ever exist in site trailers. And she and Pilar took the 2 chairs, and I took the step of the trailer. And Corin stood in the doorway with the rain behind her, looking out at the yard. She stood in that doorway for 40 minutes. I said, "In the end, you can sit down." She said, "I am all right." I said, "You have been standing since 10." And she looked at me for a moment, and then she came and sat on the trailer step at the other end of it. And there were about 8 inches between us for 2 hours. Here is what happened in those 2 hours in full, because I have been over it enough times. Marisol told a story about the pigeon years. Pilar fell asleep sitting up at about midnight with a biscuit in her hand. The rain came off the hoarding in a sheet and made a noise like applause. Corin took her coat off and put it round my shoulders without saying anything about it, and I let her, and it was charcoal in the trailer light, and very dark green when the generator surged. At about 1, without turning her head, she said, "You have your mother's hands." I said, "Everybody says that." She said, "No, everybody says you have her eye." I said, "Hands." And I sat with that for a moment, because it was true, and because it meant she had watched my hands enough at some point in 4 years to know the difference, and because she had said it looking out at a yard in the rain and not at me. The cutting kit came at 1:20. She stood up and took the coat back off my shoulders and folded it over her arm and said, "Go home," and went and held the gate for the 4 of us, like a doorman, and that was that. I walked back through the quarter at 2 in the morning in the rain, past my own laundry, twice, before I went up. By the 7th week, the mural was off the wall, and the atrium was a room with 4 blank sides and a lot of light. And Pilar asked me the question in front of 11 people. We were in the panel store. She was cutting mounting board, and I was checking the 4th bracket, the one that had been wrong. And she said, without any preamble whatsoever, "Were you married to the principal?" The room did not go silent. That is a thing that only happens in stories. 2 men carried on arguing about a delivery slot, and somebody's radio carried on playing, and the room got about 11% quieter. Which is worse? I said yes. Pilar said, "Oh." I said 4 years. Pilar said, "Right," and cut the board, and then after about a minute she said, "That explains a cup." She was standing in the doorway. I do not know how long she had been standing in the doorway. She had a rolled drawing in one hand. She came in and put it on the bench and unrolled it and weighted the corners with 2 brackets. And she said, "The ceiling grid at the south end." And we talked about the ceiling grid at the south end for 6 minutes. And then she rolled the drawing up and went out. But when Pilar said that explains the cup, the corner of her mouth moved. About a millimeter, not a smile. I had lived 4 years with that millimeter. I had cataloged it in 7 different rooms, and I would have sworn in front of any court in the country that it had not moved for anybody in 2 years. I went up the ladder afterwards and did 4 hours of work I had to do again the next morning. The 8th week was the week I found out who she had turned into, and I found it out from a doorway like everything else. There was an investor. I am going to call him the investor, because his name is in a report now and I have no interest in it. He had put money into the Ardent in 2019, and he came on the Tuesday of the 8th week with 2 people in a folder. And what he wanted was the 11th of May brought forward to the 28th of April, because the anchor tenant's board sat on the 30th. I was in the panel store with the door open, cataloging brackets, and the meeting was in the atrium because there was nowhere else with a table. He talked for 19 minutes. I timed it because I am the kind of person who times things when she is trying not to listen to them. He used the word realistic 4 times and the word partnership 6. And when he had finished, she said, no. He said, Corin, I am not asking you to cut anything. She said, you are asking me to certify a floor 2 weeks early. That is the only thing you are asking me. Everything else you have said is decoration. He tried for another 11 minutes, and she gave him the same answer in 4 different lengths. And at no point did her voice go up, and at no point did she look at her watch. I want to be precise about this because it is the thing I got wrong for 4 years of marriage. I had always read that stillness as absence. A woman who does not raise her voice, who does not hurry, who gives you 4 words when you have given her 19 minutes, is a woman who is somewhere else. And I had spent 4 years in a house believing that. What I watched from the door of a panel store in the 8th week was the same stillness pointed at a man with money, and it was not absence at all. It was the most expensive thing in the room. She was spending something to hold that line, and the price was written nowhere on her except in one place, which was a thumb pressed flat against a watch band under the table for the entire 29 minutes. The clip went into her hair at about 11 that morning. It came out at 4. It always did. That was the 11th detail I had cataloged. And I want to point out that I had cataloged 11 of them in 8 weeks without once admitting to myself that I was doing it. He left at 12:30. She stood at the plan table for a while with her hands flat on it. Then she came to the panel store door and said, I need the bracket schedule. I said, it is not finished. She said, I need what there is, and I picked up the folder off the bench and held it out, and she took it, and her fingers went across the back of my hand on the way, 1, 2, 3, and did not stop and did not pause, and were entirely and completely accidental. Neither of us said anything. She read the schedule standing in the doorway for a minute and a half. Then she said, thank you, and went. I sat down on a mounting crate and put my hands over my face for a moment, which Marisol saw, because Marisol sees everything. She came in and put a cup down on the crate next to me, the chipped one. She said, 31 years I have watched people be careful in this building. I said, do not. Marisol said, I am not saying anything. I am saying the panel store is at 14 degrees again. And she went out, and I drank the tea out of a cup with a bite out of the handle. And I did not go up the ladder for another 20 minutes. In the 9th week, I found the swallow. Panel 22 is the middle of the river, the wide part, 4 barges and a crane, and about 9 square feet of water. And it had the worst of the soot on it because it sat directly over where the stoves had been. I had been on it for 6 days. On the Tuesday, I took a 1/4-inch square down to the original, and there was a bird in it, not painted in 1911, painted over the top of the 1911 water, in a green that does not appear anywhere else in 90 feet of wall, about the size of a thumbnail, tucked under the stern of the second barge where nobody in the history of the building would ever have looked. My mother did the river in the summer of 1974, and my mother put a swallow in it, and she never told a single person, including me. I sat on the platform at 32 feet and cried for about 4 minutes, which I would like on the record was the only time. I came down at 4 to do the condition sheet, and she was at the bottom of the ladder with it in her hand already. She said, "You have been on 22 for 6 days. I said, "I found something." She said, "Show me." And I said, "You have to come up." She looked at the ladder. 11 weeks, and she had not put a foot on it except the day the board came loose. Then she gave me the sheet to hold, and she went up ahead of me, which is not how it is done. And she stood on the platform at 32 feet in a very dark green coat and looked at 9 square feet of clean 1911 water with a bird in it the size of a thumbnail. I said, "That is not 1911. She said, "No." I said, "That is 1974. She said, "Yes." And then she said, "Ada," and put her hand flat on the wall next to it. Not on it, next to it, with about an inch of air between her palm and my mother's paint. And she held it there for a while. I did not tell her anything about my mother that afternoon. I did not have to. She had sat in a hospital room with Thea Marlow for 6 days in the last February of her life, while I was on a train from a conference that would not land. And she had never mentioned it since, not once, not even in the porta cabin, when she was giving me honest answers to direct questions. Marisol told me. 3 days later, in the panel store, in her 31-year building manager voice, with her arms folded, she said, "She was there for the whole of it." I said, "I know she was there at the end." Marisol said, "I am not talking about the end. I am talking about the 9 nights. I said, "What 9 nights?" And Marisol Quintero, who has lived in the same flat on the same street in the Customs Quarter for 41 years, told me that for 9 nights in the March after I left, a car sat at the top of my road from about midnight until about 5. Same car, same place, lights off. She said, "I know the car because I have been complaining about that parking space since 1996. On the 9th night, I went down in my dressing gown to tell her about it." I said, "And?" Marisol said, and she wound the window down and said, "Good evening," and asked me whether the light on the second floor was the one at the front. I said, "And you told her?" Marisol said, "I told her it was, and I told her to go home. And she said thank you. And she went home, and she has never parked in that space again." Then Marisol picked up her clipboard and said, "The panel store is at 14 degrees, and it should be at 18, and walked out, because she had said the thing that the two of us could not say, and she was not going to stand there while I dealt with it." The 10th week was the worst of it, and almost nothing happened, which is the point. The reopening was fixed for the 11th of May, and by the first week of May, the atrium had turned into a different kind of place. The scaffold came down at the north end. The floor got polished. Somebody hung 11 meters of the wrong fabric, and somebody else took it down again. There were 40 people in that room every day who had not been in it in April, and every one of them wanted the principal for 6 minutes. She stopped coming to the bottom of the ladder at 4. I noticed on the second day. I want to be honest about that. Not the second week. the second day. On the Thursday of that week, I came out of the panel store at about 8 in the evening with the last of the condition photographs, and she was in the corridor coming the other way with the reopening seating plan. And the corridor at the back of the Ardent is 51 inches wide. We both stopped. There was a thing that could have happened there. I am not going to make more of it than it was. She had the seating plan in one hand, and her other hand came up about 6 inches and stopped. And I had my back against the plaster, and neither of us said anything at all for what I would estimate was 4 seconds. Then she said, "After the 11th." I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing. Good night, Thea." And she went past me down the corridor, and her hand did not touch me, and I stood in a 51-inch corridor with my heart going like a bird in a box, and understood that she had been holding a line for 11 weeks that I had assumed she was not even aware of. I went up the ladder the next morning at 6:30, and I took the plaster off the south return. And that is where the story stops being about the two of us. The south return is a strip of wall about 4 feet wide between the last panel and the corner, and it was never painted, so it was never in my scope. But the mounting brackets for panel 41 had to go into it. And before you put a bracket into a wall, you open it up and look at what you are putting it into. I took off a hand's width of 1911 plaster with a chisel and a mallet, and found a crack in the sheer wall behind it that I could put 3 fingers into. Not a settlement crack. Not a plaster crack. A stepped diagonal crack running through the blockwork and up out of sight behind the ceiling grid. And it had been filled once, with a cement mortar, nothing like the original, and painted over. I put my hand into a wall in a building with 400 people coming to it in 6 days, and my fingers went in up to the 3rd knuckle and found nothing on the other side. I did 4 things in the next 11 minutes, and I have never been prouder of any 11 minutes of my life. I photographed it with a scale rule in the frame. I photographed the fill. I took a sample of the fill mortar into a tube and labeled the tube. And then I went down the ladder and across the atrium. And I did not stop at the site office, and I did not send an email because there are things you do not put in an email. And I went and found her in the south stair with 2 consultants, and I said, in front of both of them, "I need you now." She said, "Excuse me," to the consultants. She was up the ladder in front of me. She put her hand into the wall in the same place mine had gone in, and her fingers went into the 3rd knuckle and stopped. And she stood there for a moment with her arm in a wall. Then she took it out and looked at the mortar dust on her hand and said one word. She said, "Marisol." The engineer came at 11. Her name was Dr. Okonkwo. She had done the original survey in the spring. She was 50 and entirely without theater, and she was on the scaffold for 3.5 hours before she said anything to anybody. At 2:30, she came down and asked for the room to be cleared. There were 9 of us left in the atrium: Corin, Marisol, Dr. Okonkwo, the main contractor, 2 of his people, the insurer's man who had arrived at noon in a car, Pilar because nobody thought to tell her to go, and me. Dr. Okonkwo said, "The crack is old." The insurer's man said, "So it is historic movement." Dr. Okonkwo said, "I said it was old. I did not say it had stopped. I am going to give you the rest of it plainly. because everybody in that room was very calm and very fast, and it was the most frightening hour I have ever spent. The Ardent has a spine wall running north to south that carries the atrium slab. In 1974, in the same summer that a 19-year-old gilder was putting the water back on the north wall, somebody had cut a service opening through that spine wall on the second floor and had not put a lintel over it and had made the whole thing good with cement mortar and a coat of paint. It had been out of sight behind a mural for 51 years. The building had been closed for 11 of those years. The building had been empty for the whole of the restoration. And on the 11th of May, the building was going to have 406 people standing on and under that slab for 2.5 hours. Dr. Okonkwo said, "I cannot certify it." The insurer's man said, "We have 6 days." Dr. Okonkwo said, "Then you have 6 days to not open." What happened next was very small. The contractor said, with respect, "We can prop it, $212,000, and we can prop the second floor and get a certificate on the 9th. And every single person in that room turned to look at the principal because it was her building and her firm and her name on the invitations. And because $212,000 and a certificate on the 9th was, as everyone standing there knew, an entirely legitimate answer. She did not look at the contractor. She looked at me. She said, "Thea, your professional opinion." I want to be exact about what she was asking, because it took me about 2 seconds to understand it, and the 2 seconds have never really finished. She was not asking me about the mural. My professional opinion on the mural was worth something, and she had it every Friday in writing. She was asking a conservator for an opinion on a sheer wall in front of an insurer, an engineer, and a main contractor, which is not my discipline. And she was doing it because I was the only person in that room who was going to be able to say the thing that cost her everything. She was handing me the knife because she did not trust herself to hold it. I said, "The fill in that opening is a 1970s cement mortar, and the crack runs through it, not around it. That means the fill failed after it went in." I do not know how fast. Nobody in this room knows how fast, including Dr. Okonkwo, and she is the best in the country. Dr. Okonkwo said, "That is correct." I said, "I would not put 400 people in this room in 6 days, and I would not put 11 in it in 6 weeks. And if you prop the second floor on Friday, I will not be signing the panel remounting certificate because I will not certify work into a wall I have my whole hand inside." The insurer's man said, "Do you understand what you are saying?" I said, "I do." And then I said the sentence that I had spent 3 days getting to and did not know I had until it came out. I said, "My mother spent a summer on that wall. I am not going to be the one who puts people underneath it." She canceled it at 4:40 that afternoon, standing up in 11 words. She said, "We close the site, we notify the guests, we go public." The insurer's man said the thing about the financing. She said, "I know." The contractor said the thing about the program and the trades and the 14 months. She said, "I know." And then she said, "Thank you all," in a voice you could have used to read out a train timetable, and everybody went, and Marisol went and sat down on the step of the trailer for a long time, with her hands on her knees. Here is what canceling it cost, since nobody in the story ever says it out loud in a way that sounds like it costs anything. The Ardent was Vale and Ward's building, not a commission. Theirs. Her father had bought the shell out of the closure in 2009 with money the firm did not have, and she had spent 11 years and the entire value of the practice getting it to the 11th of May. The reopening was not a party. It was the day the anchor tenants signed. The financing was drawn against the certificate, and the certificate was drawn against the 11th. She canceled it in 11 words at 20 to 5 on a Tuesday. And by the following Monday, the practice was in a process that has a very polite name and one outcome. She did not tell me any of that. I found it out afterwards, the way I found out most true things about that woman. From a 68-year-old building manager with her arms folded. I went up to her office at about 7 that evening because I could not go home. The office was dark except for the lamp. She had the seating plan for the 11th of May on the desk in front of her. 406 names. And she was going down it with a pen and putting a small mark next to the ones who would need a telephone call rather than a letter. I stood in the doorway for a while. She said, without looking up, "You were right." I said, "I know I was right. That is not why I came up." She put the pen down. I said, "You handed me the knife." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" And she looked at me across a desk with 406 names on it, and she said, "Because you are the only person I have ever known who does the expensive thing first." I went home at 11 and did not sleep. And at 2 in the morning, I got the kit box down off the shelf and took the paper out of the lid and looked at it. 1. She is a client. 2. No trailer. 3. If she says my name, do not answer with hers. 4. 8 months. Then out. 5. Do not ask her anything else. I did not tear it up. I want to be truthful. I put it back in the lid and closed the box and lay in the dark until it got light. And then I got up and went to the Ardent to take my mother's river off the wall for the last time. Because with the reopening canceled, the panels had to come off and go into store. And there were 4 of them left. And the 406 people had all been telephoned, and every single one of them came anyway. The 11th of May was the warmest day of that spring. And by 6 o'clock, there were 400 people in the square. Nobody organized it. That is the part I still cannot entirely account for. The letters had gone out on the Wednesday, and the letters were honest, which is to say they used the words structural and indefinite and regret, and somebody put it in the paper on the Friday. And on the Sunday, a woman who runs a bakery on the north side of the square put a table out at 6 o'clock in the evening on the 11th of May with 40 cups on it. By 10 past 6, there were 400 people out there with their programs, standing in front of a building they could not go into, applauding a woman who had canceled on them. Corin stood at the top of the steps for 11 minutes and let them do it. I watched from inside through the glass. She had the very dark green coat on and her thumb flat against the watch band the entire time. And when it was over, she said about 4 sentences that I could not hear, and everybody laughed. And then she came back through the doors into an empty atrium. I was on the floor with the last crate. I want to give you the last 11 minutes properly, because I have had a great deal of time to think about them since, and they are not what you would expect. Panels 38 to 41 were down and faced and in the frames. The floor was clear. The scaffold was gone from the north end, and there was one tower left at the south return, over the place where I had put my hand into the wall. She came across the marble and stopped about 4 feet away and said, "Everyone else is out." I said, 11 minutes? She said, "I will wait." I said, "You do not have to wait." She said, "I know." And she went and stood by the plan table with her hands in her coat pockets and waited. And I knelt on the floor of her building with a roll of tissue and did the last 11 minutes of an 8-month commission, and neither of us said anything else at all. And it was the most companionable I have felt with another person in 2 years. At 6:40, I heard a sound like a door closing very far away, in a building where every door was already closed. I looked up. She was already looking at the ceiling. I said, "What was that?" She said, "Get up." It did not come down like they do in films. It came down like weather. There was a second sound, longer, a low grinding somewhere above the second floor. And then a fine gray rain of dust came out of the ceiling grid across a line about 40 feet long. And I remember thinking, with complete clarity and no urgency whatsoever, that it was following the exact route of the crack. I got up. I got up too slowly because I had a crate of my mother's river in front of me, and my whole body wanted to do something about it. She crossed those 4 feet faster than I have ever seen a human being move. She did not pull me. That is what everybody gets wrong when I tell it. She did not pull me towards the doors, because there were 90 feet of marble between us and the doors, and she had done the arithmetic and the time it took the dust to fall. She put both arms round me and turned us both so that her back was to the south return, and took us down into the angle where the plan table met the wall, and put her body over mine. The last thing I saw before the dark was the underside of a table 2 feet from my face, and her hand flat on the floor by my head with a watch on the wrist. Then the atrium slab of the Ardent came down, and the world became extremely simple. Noise, then no noise. The noise was not what I expected either. It was not a crash. It was a series of enormous flat sounds, one after another, going away from us. And then a very long silence that had a ringing in it. And then somewhere, a long way off, a car alarm. I could not see. There was dust in my eyes, and in my teeth, and in the back of my throat, and the air had a taste like a struck match. I could not move my left arm. There was a weight across both my ankles that was not heavy so much as absolute. And there was a woman on top of me who was not making any sound at all. I said her name into the dark. I said it about 11 times. And then her hand found the side of my jaw, and her forehead came down against mine, and she said into my ear, in a voice with dust in it and nothing else wrong with it, the 3 words. She said, "I have you." I would like to explain what happened to me at that moment, and I have never once managed it in a way that sounds like anything other than nonsense. Cedar, rain on stone, 2 years and 2 months, and a discontinued color came back in a black room under 900 tons of somebody else's mistake. I said, "I can smell you." She said, "I know." I said, "That is not possible." She said, "Thea, breathe out." We were under there for 5 hours and 11 minutes, and I am going to tell you about all of it because the part everybody wants to hear is about 90 seconds long and it does not make any sense without the rest. The plan table saved us. Not entirely. The slab came down across the south half of the atrium, and the north half came down about 4 seconds later. And the table, which was a 1911 customs desk, with the top 4 inches thick that Marisol had refused to let anybody throw away in 1996, took the corner of a section of floor and held it about 20 inches off the ground. That is what we had. 20 inches, roughly 9 feet by 4, and a great deal of dust. My left arm was under me and asleep. My ankles were under something I could not see and could not shift, and which, it turned out later, was a piece of the ceiling grid weighing about 40 kilos. Her right hand was flat on the floor by my head. Her left arm was under my back. And she could not move at all because there was a slab of the second floor lying across her from her shoulders down. I found that out in the first 10 minutes, and it is the worst 10 minutes of my life. I said, "Can you move?" She said, "No." I said, "At all?" She said, "My hands." I said, "Are you hurt?" And she said, "I do not know." Which, from a woman who has never in her life given an approximate answer to anything, was the single most frightening sentence I have ever heard. Here is what 5 hours under a floor is actually like. It is cold, which surprised me. It is not silent. There are noises all the time, small ones, settling ones, and every one of them makes your whole body go rigid. And then nothing happens. Your mouth goes dry in about 40 minutes and stays that way. You are not brave. There is nothing to be brave about because there is nothing to do. You lie in the dark under 20 inches of somebody else's building and you make conversation because the alternative is listening to the noises. At about 7:30, we heard the first machines. At about 8, a dog. At about 9, a voice. A long way up and off to the north calling out a number and then a name that was not either of ours, and then going away again. She said, "They are working the north side first." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the north side came down 4 seconds later. There will be voids." I said, "There are voids here." She said, "They do not know that." At about 10 o'clock, I asked her the second direct question of my life, and it came out of me sideways. Because everything comes out of you sideways at 10 o'clock at night under a floor. I said 39 pieces of paper. She said 1 application. I said, "Marisol talks." She said, "Marisol has talked continuously since 1994. And then, after a while, without being asked anything further, in the dark, with a section of the second floor lying across her, she told me the whole of it in about 11 sentences. Which is more consecutive words than I heard from that woman in the last 2 years of our marriage. She said, "I read it at 3:10. She said, "I knew what it was before I picked it up." She said, "I did not contest it because a contest is an argument that you are owed something." I was not owed anything. I had done a sum about you in my head, and the sum was that you would still be there tomorrow, and I want you to understand that I did not do that sum once. I did it for 3 years every time I chose the site over the house, and it came out the same way every time. And then one day it came out wrong, and it was not wrong. It was the first time it had been right. She said, "I sat at the top of your road for 9 nights. She said, "On the 9th night, a woman in a dressing gown told me to go home. And she was correct. She said, I have spent 2 years becoming a person who would have come on the 18th. I did not want to come back to you until it was done. And then your mother's building fell to me. And there are 3 people in the country who can do the work, and 2 of them are over 70. And then she said the only unguarded thing I have ever heard her say. She said, Thea, I have been very careful for 11 weeks, and I am running out of floor. I lay in the dark with dust on my face and cedar and rain on stone in the back of my throat for the first time in 2 years. And I said the thing I had written on a piece of paper and pinned inside a box. I said Rule 5 was do not ask her anything else. She said, how did that go? I said, badly. She said, good. The cold came in at about 10:30, and it came in from the floor. I had been lying on 1911 marble for 4 hours by then, with a coat over me that she had not been wearing when the ceiling came down, which meant she had got it over me in the 4 seconds, which meant she had done that as well. I started shaking and could not stop, and she heard it because there was nothing else to hear. She said, talk. I said, about what? She said, anything, talk about the panels. So I did the panels. I went along 90 feet of my mother's river in the dark, from north to south, 1 to 41. And I told her what was in each of them, which barge, which crane, which of the 11 men had a face, and which of them was only a shoulder, where the 1911 painter had run out of the good blue and switched to a cheaper one at panel 17, and hoped nobody would ever stand close enough to see, where the water goes from being water to being the idea of water because he was tired. And it was August. It took about 40 minutes. She did not interrupt once, except at panel 22, where she said, the bird. I said, the bird. She said, tell me about your mother. Nobody had asked me that in 2 years. People ask you about your mother for about 6 weeks and then they stop. And after that, you are a woman who does not have one. And there is no way back into the subject that does not flatten a dinner party. I said she was 19 that summer. She said, I know, go on. And I told her, in the dark, under a floor, about a girl from the technical school across the river who got a summer on a scaffold because a foreman owed her father money, and who was not credited, and who went home at the end of August and did not touch a wall again for 11 years, and who said one sentence about it for the rest of her life in the same flat voice. I said, she said, I did the river. Corin said she did the river. I said she never told me about the bird. And Corin said after a while, she told me, I want to be careful here because this is the part I have never been able to say out loud without stopping in the middle. She said, in the hospital, in the February, on the 4th day when you were on the train. She said she told me there was a swallow under the second barge and that nobody had ever found it, and that she had decided this was funny rather than sad. She said, and I said I would find it. I said, you have known where it was for 2 years. She said, I have known there was one. I did not know where. She would not say, and she was extremely pleased with herself about it. And then she said the sentence that undid every single one of the 5 rules in the lid of my kit box. She said, I did not give you that commission because you are the best conservator in the country. Although you are. I gave it to you because your mother left something in that wall for you. and I was not going to be the person who let a contractor find it. I did not say anything for a long time. The dust had stopped moving. Somewhere north of us, a machine came on and ran for a minute and went off. My ankles had gone from hurting to not being there, which I now know is worse and did not know then. Her hand was flat on the floor by my head, and her fingers had gone very cold. I said, "Are your hands cold?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Is that new?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Corin." She said, "Do not." I said, "Corin." And she said, "I know, keep talking, go back to panel 1. At about 11:30, the noises above us changed and got closer and then stopped for a long time. And in that silence, I said her name. I said, "Corin." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want it back." She did not answer for long enough that I said it again. And she said, "Do not say it twice. Say it once and mean it." I said, "I want the bond back. I am asking. I am not asking because we are under a floor." She said, "Say that part again." I said, "I am not asking because we are under a floor. I would have asked you in a 51-inch corridor on Thursday if you had waited 4 more seconds. And she said, "I know." I counted them. You cannot do it accidentally. That is the whole architecture of the thing. An alpha cannot take a bond, and an omega cannot be given one. And the only way it has ever worked in the entire history of us is that the omega asks out loud, and the alpha answers. She said, "Thea Marlow." I said, "Yes." She said, "Look at me." I said, "I cannot see you." She said, "I know. Look at me anyway." Her hand came off the floor and found the side of my jaw in the dark, and her thumb moved once across my cheek, and this time it did not stop moving. She turned my head. Her forehead came down against mine and stayed there for a moment. Then her mouth was at the side of my neck, at the place where the mark had been for 4 years, and the scar had been for 2. And the floor came back under the chair. And this is where I have to stop, because what happened next was never meant for YouTube. If you want the uncut version, it's waiting on my Patreon. The link is in the description. They came through to us at 11 minutes to midnight. The first thing was light, not a torch. A thin blue line of light about the width of a finger, 40 feet away and low down. And then a voice much closer than I expected saying, "We have 2. And somebody else a long way off shouting a number. The second thing was that she said, "Take her first." Before anybody had asked either of us anything, the man at the other end of the void said, "Ma'am, we take the one who can walk." She said, "Then take her first." It took them 90 minutes to get me out and 4 hours to get her out. And I did not know that until the following afternoon, because the moment they got my ankles clear, somebody put a collar on me and a blanket over me and carried me up a spoil ramp into a square with 400 people still standing in it at 1:30 in the morning. Marisol Quintero was at the top of the ramp. She had been at the top of that ramp since 7:20. She took hold of my hand and walked beside the board all the way to the ambulance. And she said one thing. I said, "She is alive. She is talking. There is a floor across her back." Marisol said, "I know all that." I said one thing. I said, "What?" And Marisol said, "She asked me in March which window was yours. and I have been waiting 2 years to find out why. Her back was not broken. I want to put that in a sentence of its own because for 9 hours, it was the only sentence in the world. 2 ribs, a shoulder that came out and went back in, 40% of the surface of her back, the color of a storm for about a month, and a hairline fracture in the left wrist under the watch, which had stopped at 6:41 and which she has never had repaired. She came out of the Ardent at 4:10 in the morning under the lights with 400 people in the square, and she was conscious. And the first thing she asked was whether they had got the crate. They had got the crate. Panel 22 came out of that building without a mark on it, which the conservation press wrote about for a year, and which is, I promise you, the least interesting thing that happened that night. I stayed. That is the entire content of the following 9 days, and I am not going to dress it up. There is a chair in that hospital, and I sat in it. Marisol brought food that nobody ate. Pilar came on the 4th day with a card signed by 41 trades, including the man who had not clipped the board, which I thought was a great deal more gracious of him than of us. On the second night, a nurse came in at about 2 in the morning and found me asleep with my forehead against the side of the bed and my hand round her wrist under the watch. And she woke me up to tell me I could not sleep like that. And then she looked at the 2 of us properly and she said, "When did it reform?" I said, "On the 11th. She said, "Under the building?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, they do that," in the voice of a woman who has been doing nights for 30 years. And she put a second blanket on the chair and left us alone. The floor was back and I could not stop testing it. For the first 3 days, I did it every few minutes, the way you press a tooth. Corin is 9 feet away and to the left. Corin is asleep. Corin has woken up and has not opened her eyes yet. Corin is in the corridor with the consultant and is annoyed about something. Corin is 4 floors down in the car park, having an argument on the telephone that she is going to lose and is going to describe to me later as a conversation. She caught me at it on the 5th day. She was flat on her back with 2 ribs strapped, and she could turn her head about 11 degrees, and she said, "Stop poking it." I said, "I am not poking it." She said, "Thea." I said, "I am poking it." She said, "Good, poke it." The firm went in the 2nd week of June. There's a polite name for the process, and I have never once used it. What it means is that a woman spent 11 years and everything her father left her getting a building to the 11th of May and canceled it in 11 words on the 6th of May. And by the 12th of June, there was no practice. Vale and Ward is now 4 people over a bicycle shop on the north side of the square, and the 4 people are Corin, a technician who would not leave, Pilar, who finished her qualification in the autumn and is going to be better than me, and a 68-year-old building manager who has no formal role of any kind and who runs it completely. The Ardent belongs to the city now. It is coming down to the 2nd floor and going back up over 4 years, and Dr. Okonkwo is on the panel. And on the 22nd of May, while she was still on 2 ribs and a shoulder, the insurer's man came to the house with the file and sat at the kitchen table and explained, in a great many words, that the cancellation on the 6th had moved 406 people out of a room that fell down 5 days later. She said, "I know what it did. He said, "The underwriters are minded to describe the decision as prudent." She said it was not prudent. It was late. I want to say one more thing about her. And then I will stop because you have been very patient. On the 18th of June, she came home at 8 o'clock. There was nothing to come home for. There was no anniversary in it, and no dinner arranged, and I had not mentioned any date to her in 2 years, and she was still not supposed to be lifting anything. And she came up the stairs of a flat, over a laundry, in the customs quarter at 4 minutes to 8, with her arm still in a sling, and a paper bag from the bakery on the north side of the square. She put the bag on the table. She sat down. She looked at the clock on the wall, which is the only clock in our house that has ever been right. And she said, 8 o'clock. I said, it is 4 minutes to. She said, I know, I have been on the stairs since 10 to. The mural went back up in March, not in the Ardent. The Ardent will not be ready until 2030, and the panels could not sit in a store that long. So they went to the new hall on the south side of the river, where the city put them on a purpose-built wall with the light coming in from the east, which is better light than they had in 1911, and I will not be taking questions about that. 41 panels, 90 feet of river traffic and cranes, and men with their sleeves rolled. And under the stern of the second barge in panel 22, if you know exactly where to stand and you are prepared to be told, you are imagining it. A swallow about the size of a thumbnail in a green that does not appear anywhere else on the wall. They put a plate up. I wrote it. It says, "The River 1911, restored 1974 by Thea Marlow Gilder, and again in 2026. Marisol said it should have my name on it as well, and I said it does. We have 2 enamel cups now. One of them has a bite out of it at the handle, and the other one has a bite out of it at the handle. And Pilar, who visits on Sundays and eats everything in the house, has never once asked about it, which for Pilar is an act of enormous discipline. The watch is on the left wrist, and it says 6:41, and it always will. She wore it through the whole of the hearing. About once a week, her thumb goes flat against the band while she is deciding something, and I catch myself watching it, and she catches me watching it, and neither of us says anything at all. And that is fine now. That is allowed now. The scar at the side of my neck went and came back in a slightly different place, about half an inch lower, which apparently happens and which nobody warns you about. And every so often at 3 or 4 in the morning, I still wake up and press the tooth. Corin is here. Corin is asleep on her back because of the ribs and will be for another month. Corin is awake, actually, and has been for a while, and is lying in the dark being extremely quiet about it so as not to wake me. Last night she felt me do it, and she did not say stop poking it. She turned her head on the pillow, about 11 degrees, which is still all she can manage. And she found the side of my jaw with her hand in the dark, the way she did under 20 inches of somebody else's building. And she said the 3 words she said down there, and the 3 words she has said every night since, and the 3 words I intend to hear for the rest of my life. She said, I have you.